So this week, we'll begin our discussion of queer urbanities by focusing a little bit on some context. What were some of the preconditions that gave rise to the development of queer communities, both queer male communities and also queer female communities across class lines? And while there are a number of developments that are really important, I think there are three that are worth highlighting in this lecture format: industrialization, urbanization, and the rise of vice districts and slumming. So let's start with industrialization. So, in our public memory, there's a way in which industrialization is perceived to have begun at the end of the 19th century and really takes off during the early 20th. However, that isn't exactly accurate. Various forms of industrialization had begun since the middle of the first half of the 19th century, or about the 1820s and 1830s. However, it's only in the aftermath of the Civil War, the consolidation of strength with the federal government, and the rise of increasing demand for cotton overseas, that the United States really becomes an industrial powerhouse. Moreover, there are a number of business and economic developments, specifically the rise of corporation and the imposition of laissez-faire economics, that really facilitates the rise of certain forms of industrialization and also industrial work. And while there's much more to say here, I just want to flag that during this period under discussion for today, the 1880s through the end of the 1920s, really, by and large, the federal government had a fairly hands-off or laissez-faire kind of attitude towards business. And this allowed kind of business and industrialization to thrive in particular ways. I'm flagging that for our purposes because I want us to be aware of the ways in which the involvement or lack of involvement, or the lack of intervention or intervention of the federal government will have really important ramifications for the rise of a new sexual and gendered order during the late 19th and early 20th century. So all of that's to say, while we see a relatively hands-off kind of approach with regard to the economy, it's much more of a kind of convoluted story with regard to the federal government, but also state and local governments, whereas they continue to be concerned about various forms of vice and also homosexuality. Next, let's move to urbanization. So the rise of industrialization, largely in and around major cities, facilitated the dramatic increase of urban residents. So these urban residents came from any number of places. They came from the rural countryside, both in surrounding kind of regions, but also in other regions across the United States. And here I want to particularly flag the migration of Southern, largely rural African Americans to northern urban centers. This was also a time of dramatic global immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, as well as from Eastern and Southeastern Asia, places like China and also India. So it's a time in which urban communities are becoming increasingly diverse, both diverse with regard to culture and language, but also with regard to ethnicity and race as well. And these urban communities oftentimes, as I'll speak a little bit more about in a second, yes, consisted of nuclear households, yes, consisted of extended families, but also increasingly consisted of single individual wage earners who were untethered to or unmoored from nuclear households that may have been more common both in their communities of origin, either within the United States or outside of it. And so this increased independence of usually young, but not exclusively, but young kind of single people also created opportunities for different forms of sociality and engagement, different forms of sexual experimentation, but also gendered experiences as well. Next, we have the rise of kind of red light districts and slumming. So as industrialization and increasing urbanization dramatically reshaped the face of cities, there was the development of particular zones within major cities like Chicago, like New York, even places like Portland and Seattle, where a number of activities, largely illegal, often viewed as morally suspect, were allowed to thrive. These spaces were called red light districts. So in places like New York City, there were famous red light districts in the Tenderloin and in Harlem, and in Chicago on the south side of the city. And in these red light districts, a whole host of illicit or illegal underground activities would take place, like gambling, the illegal sale and manufacture of liquor. This would become especially important during the era of Prohibition. Sex work, also known as prostitution at the time, and various forms of gambling. And it's interesting because in many of these major cities, these red light districts, or vice districts as they were also known, happen to overlap and correspond with places that were largely filled with immigrant communities, and also communities of color, so Chinese communities and Black communities in particular. And so we might be asking ourselves, or sort of, where did these red light districts come from? Why were they allowed to thrive and flourish? And one of the significant answers to this is that the flourishing of these particular districts was a direct reflection of intensified policing in other largely racially coded as white spaces of the city and suburbs, right? What suburbs existed at the time around these major metropolitan areas that then pushed certain forms of illegal or illicit activity into these red light districts. But it also is about a sort of lack of policing or implicit sanctioning on the part of law enforcement officials in these particular districts. And by sanctioning, what I mean is that local police departments, or members of local police forces, I should say, actually regularly took bribes or monetary payments to basically turn a blind eye to these illegal activities and to not prosecute offenders. And so this created a really interesting and important set of circumstances in which we have parts of the city and the surrounding areas racially coded as white that are not being associated with certain forms of illegal activity, right? Activity that is both, again, associated with drinking and gambling, but also with various forms of what was perceived as sexual immorality as well. Whereas we have these inner city zones, right? These zones within urban spaces, many of which are coded as non-white or marginally white. This is a time in which whiteness is also in flux and in which kind of the a priori or most kind of central form of whiteness were white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, so that would leave out certain European immigrants. So you have these zones, these non-white or non-WASP zones being increasingly associated with various forms of vice and perceived immorality. And so what that does, it creates a really organic kind of confluence between various forms of crime, vice, illegality, and various forms of non-whiteness, immigrant status, right, working class status. So we might think to ourselves that there are these kind of segregated red light districts, and then there are these racially coded middle class and elite areas in other parts of the city, and that there's a sort of strict segregation between the two. But actually what emerges, beginning really prominently in the 1880s and moving through the 1930s, is a set of practices or excursions on the part of elite and middle class, largely white, but not exclusively so, city and suburban residents to these red light districts to participate in the vibrant nightlife and the various illicit activities contained therein. This was called slumming. Slumming was the practice of middle class and elite, largely white, urban and suburban residents engaging in various forms of commercialized leisure in these urban spaces. Again, behaviors like gambling, like sex work, like during Prohibition, illegal consumption of alcohol, but also a whole host of other behaviors or activities that, while not necessarily illegal, were deemed to be, by the kind of mainstream standards and mores of the day, particularly unsavory, such as crossing the color line and fraternizing with individuals of African descent or from other communities of color, being present in spaces where individuals who maybe were gender nonconforming or engaging in same-sex intimacy were present, viewing various forms of cabaret shows that featured what at the time was understood and framed as kind of primitivist performances of jazz or the blues. So why is slumming and these red light districts important? It's important because it becomes a part of a larger process by which in American life and later law and policy, there's a binary that's created. A binary of heterosexuality and homosexuality, with one heterosexuality being sanctioned and indeed promoted, or I'm sorry, with one heterosexuality being protected and indeed promoted, and the other being denigrated and marginalized and punished. And one of the crucial things about this heterosexual homosexual binary, as we'll see over the next few weeks, is that it often uses the kind of racial binary as a reference point. So whiteness as being linked to morality, to intellectual thinking, to civilization, and blackness being linked to primitivism, being linked to backwardness, being linked to criminality, being linked to sexual immorality. And so there are all of these ways in which this sexual binary, this binary of sexual identity, uses this binary of racial identity as a really crucial reference point. And that's played out in all kinds of ways in these local spaces. And so now we'll turn to our next lecture, which will think about queer working class male communities and identities in places like New York and Chicago.